Hello, I'm Dr. Charlie Collins. Let's talk about research methods. Today I'm going to talk about survey methods. I will discuss the general features of survey research, cross-sectional versus longitudinal designs, forms of survey data collection, and the process of conducting a survey. Today, our running example of research is conducted by sociologist Robert Sampson, who studies this idea called collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is the idea that people in neighborhoods have the social connections and the ability or capacity to address collective community concerns, including issues such as crime. In his research, he has continuously found that neighborhoods that report greater levels of collective efficacy have much lower crime rates compared to neighborhoods with low levels of collective efficacy. So, how did Sampson get his data? He did so through a combination of household surveys and crime statistics, and then linked the two geographically. Now, before this gets too complex, let's just stick with the household surveys, which is what he used to identify levels of collective efficacy within neighborhoods. So what is a survey in the first place? I'm assuming you're familiar with them. Most companies use them for things like customer satisfaction, pollsters use them to understand things like presidential approval, and BuzzFeed uses them to identify how weird your bath habits are. Literally, that's really a BuzzFeed survey. Technically, surveys are structured questionnaires or interviews that seek to understand individuals' behaviors, perceptions, or opinions about various topics. Structured means that the questions and response options are predetermined. If you've ever taken a BuzzFeed survey, you'll know that those predetermined responses options aren't always the most accurate. For Sampson's research on collective efficacy, he and his team developed questions and scales to measure residents' perceptions of different components of collective efficacy. For example, he asked questions such as, if there were graffiti in your neighborhood, how likely are your neighbors to do something about it? And he gave residents a 5-point scale to rate how likely they thought their neighbors would take action on that particular issue. But before we get into the structure of surveys, let's talk about general features of surveys. There are 3 general features of surveys: a large-scale probability sample, structured interviews or questionnaires, and quantitative data analysis. Sampson conducted his research in Chicago and used a combination of cluster sampling and simple random sampling, and included over 8,000 households. First, he randomly selected different neighborhoods in Chicago, then randomly sampled households within those neighborhoods to get good representation of neighborhoods and households in Chicago. Second, as I mentioned earlier, he created a structured survey and implemented it using a structured interview method. What he did was take a survey around to each household, sat down with residents in those homes, and filled out the survey for them by asking them the questions and having them respond to predetermined options. This is considered a structured interview. Finally, because those survey responses were rated on what we call a Likert type scale, meaning they were rated on a point system, Sampson conducted quantitative data analysis on those responses. So Sampson's research fit all 3 of those criteria mentioned before. Sampson's research was cross-sectional, meaning his sample was given the survey at one point in time, and that was it. Much of survey research is cross-sectional simply because it can be very difficult to study the same group of people over time. They can be hard to find, and it can violate ethics to track people, and it can be really, really expensive. Cross-sectional designs allow us to examine the relationship between variables at one point in time. Unfortunately, we can't see how things change in a cross-sectional design, which is why we have longitudinal designs. Longitudinal designs are those that examine the same constructs or variables over time. There are 2 types of longitudinal designs: trend studies and panel studies. Trend studies are like a repeated cross-sectional survey over time with a new sample. For example, Sampson could have employed this method if he drew a new sample, let's say each year, and conducted his structured interview with a new set of 8,000 households. We typically see trend designs in things like political polling, where they're not polling the same people over the time, but they're asking the same questions to different people. Panel designs, on the other hand, use the same sample with multiple measurements over time. So again, for Samson, it would be tracking and conducting structured interviews with the same households over time with a predetermined time frame for each survey. As I've mentioned, Samson used structured interviews, also known as face-to-face interviews, to collect his data. Historically, face-to-face interviews most typically used pencil and paper, where the researchers would write down interviewee responses. Most recently, however, face-to-face researchers have employed computer technology in the form of computer-assisted personal interview techniques, where instead of writing responses from interviewees, researchers enter the data into a computer system and directly create a database. The great thing about these systems is that it skips the data entry portion of the research process that pencil and paper techniques used and provides researchers with a near immediate data set. Another form of data collection is the telephone survey. This is similar to face-to-face interviews but over the phone. These were very popular back in the day when people had home phones where their numbers were semi-publicly available. As you can imagine, this made random sampling a bit easier. But given the move to cell phones and away from home phones, these have lost popularity, mostly because the demographics of people with home phones are skewed more toward older residents and no longer represent the larger population, the larger US population. We've talked about researchers administering surveys to respondents in person or over the phone through paper and pencil or computer methods. Fortunately, we can do the same thing without the assistance of researchers, where respondents complete surveys on their own using similar methods. You more likely have done this through course evaluations. In the past, course evaluations used paper and pencil methods where students would fill out the questionnaire in the classroom. This has shifted for some online surveys where students complete the questionnaire online. But before we utilize any of these methods, we must make a plan. We've already discussed one of the first steps, which is choosing our mode of data collection, either in person, over the phone, or self-report using pencil and paper, or online methods. The next step, which is one of the most difficult, is developing the actual survey. This is one of the most difficult because it's necessary to accurately capture your constructs of interest, make sure you ask all the questions you need to ask, and do it in a way that fits your sample. For me, survey construction can be more of an art than a science. Once you have your survey constructed, you want to pre-test the survey to make sure it makes sense and work out any issues you may have. The next two steps are identifying your sampling frame and sample, and then collecting your data. Finally, after data collection is complete, you need to clean your data. This includes coding any open-ended questions and editing any errors or inaccuracies in the data. This is especially true of self-report data where respondents complete the survey on their own. Once you've gone through this process, you now have a quantitative data set to analyze and to make sense of. Well, that's all we have for this discussion of survey methods. By now, you should be familiar with the general features of survey research, cross-sectional versus longitudinal designs, forms of survey data collection, and the process of conducting a survey. Thank you for watching. I'm Dr. Charlie Collins, and I'll see you next time.